For me, panic disorder, sometimes incorrectly referred to as a nervous breakdown, began a few years back, but the actual symptoms of anxiety, more specifically health anxiety, began much sooner. As a healthcare worker, I witnessed an array of medical complications on a nightly basis that most people in the general public rarely ever encounter. But for people in my profession, those major medical problems seem far more common and likely than they actually are, and this can create an excess of awareness for those potential problems. So when I developed chronic health conditions of my own, I naturally assumed the worst. I lived in a state of constant dread, believing that the progression of my illness into the worst possible outcome was inevitable. I consulted doctors, ran tests, took meds and supplements, scoured the ends of the internet for some explanation or solution, all the while waiting for the other shoe to drop. This was my daily state of mind over the next few years. So as you can imagine, when the pandemic hit, it only piled onto these stresses. What I didn't realize at the time was that behind the scenes of my conscious mind, the anxiety centers of my brain were becoming hypersensitized. That is to say that chronic cortisol exposure was exhausting my sympathetic nervous system's ability to regulate my fear response. And so, eventually, it all came to a head. I experienced what I would later come to realize was my first panic attack. This is where things went from bad to worse. During that particular episode, I truly believed that the symptoms I was feeling were that of a stroke, the stroke that I had been hyping myself into believing was inevitable over the past few years. This in turn ramped up my fear into a full-blown state of panic, but eventually it calmed down, and I dismissed it as a freak incident. It wasn't until a week later that it happened again. This time I was driving with my family when suddenly, I felt short of breath. And of course, with all my health anxiety, I once again assumed the worst and rushed to the ER for a series of tests that revealed I was by all diagnostic measures a healthy individual. They discharged me with nothing more than a bruised ego and unanswered questions. Then it started to get strange. The next day, I awoke with this bizarre flutter sensation in my head. It came and went throughout the day, ramping up progressively worse into the night until I finally slept. This happened again the following day, and the day after that, continuing in this pattern for a few weeks. I started to fear the worst again, believing this was some form of early onset dementia, or schizophrenia, or Parkinson's, or some other ultimately terrible thing. I met with my primary care doctor and he suggested that it was a panic attack. But I had researched panic attacks and they are only supposed to last between 10 to 30 minutes max. While these episodes seemed to extend for periods of 8 hours or more, until I would basically just collapse from utter exhaustion. And even then, my sleep was anxious and disrupted. I had chest pain constantly, brain zaps, sweats, and shakes. My hands felt numb, and I feared that I would lose consciousness while driving. My PCP was kind enough to humor me by running a whole slew of diagnostic tests to rule out the possibility of any condition that might be causing these symptoms, other than anxiety. And sure enough, one by one, they all came back negative. And so I accepted this diagnosis of anxiety. I tried to schedule a consultation with a psychiatrist, who unfortunately was booked out 6 months in advance. So I turned to the internet for answers. I discovered a condition that described panic attacks, which occurred in a sort of rapid-fire succession, in intervals so close together that they seemed like one long continuous episode. And that explained in part the strange duration of these attacks. This gave me the awareness which I could use to distinguish between the gaps of these episodes, which had otherwise been blurred by lingering stress hormones and fatigued nerves. The episodes increased in severity to bouts of uncontrollable shaking and crying fits. I seriously considered going on disability from my job because it was just too intense to focus on anything else. My mind went to the darkest places of despair, and I existed in this state of constant agony from the moment I woke up, to the moment when I crashed from exhaustion, only sleeping in short, anxious bursts, for a period of roughly 3 months. During that time, I believed with absolute certainty that my life was over.